Your loadout is everything in Destiny 2. With the Light 3.0 subclass and Strand receiving new aspects this season, we've been seeing pretty consistent updates to everything except Stasis. In this video, we are going to go into detail on what's happening with the First Darkness subclass, so sit back, wind down, and tune in. My name is Art, and welcome to Destiny Guides. Right now, we're in a meta where just about every subclass is relevant in some way. Each one brings a unique spin and playstyle that can lead to some nasty combos with the right loadout. During the Final Shape showcase, we were shown that there would be new supers for each of the light subclasses, specifically Arc Hunter, Solar Warlock, and Void Titan. They told us what the functions and most of the properties of these supers would be, and they seem pretty interesting. I'm personally pretty excited for the Titan. It'll be really cool to chuck axes everywhere while letting my teammates use them. In addition to this, it's only been about a month since Season 23 dropped, and each class was given a new aspect for Strand. Don't get me wrong, this makes sense. It's the newest subclass, so if anything was going to receive an update, it would be Strand. A couple of these aspects were and still kind of are game-breaking. Strand Warlock was a nightmare for a lot of people in Crucible, and someone soloed the Eerie Ute encounter from the reprised Crota raid using Banner of War. I say all of this to point out that every subclass is being updated and touched on by Bungie to keep them at least somewhat fresh and interesting, and that's pretty great. Even if things aren't exactly how I'd want them to be, it's great to see them give players reasons to try new things or revisit old subclasses because they got updated. But while all of this is happening, it feels like we're getting these revisions at the cost of not receiving changes to something else, Stasis. Now, Stasis hasn't had the best history with the Destiny community. For those that don't know, along with the Beyond Light campaign, it was announced that we'd be getting access to a Darkness subclass for the first time. Back then, everyone was understandably pretty hyped to be able to use something new and interesting outside of the base Light subclasses that we've had since D1. But this turned out to be a classic example of expectation versus reality. When players got full access to Stasis, it was quickly seen as interesting. In the realm of PvE, Stasis for the most part felt a little underwhelming, which in a way makes sense, given that it was new and there were next to no exotics for it. But where Stasis really shined was in the Crucible, even more so if you were a hunter. To say that Stasis became the meta would be an understatement. While some were better than others, each class had the ability to freeze other players and essentially take away their ability to play the video game. But the thing that upset people the most was the option that Stasis Hunters had. This class had a literal one-tap burst option that was difficult to react to, had a ridiculous amount of range, and low cooldown. The option in question was Hunters using the aspect Shatter Dive to slam on top of Stasis crystals, shatter them, and kill other Guardians as a result. This build was oppressive. You could mix and match fragments to make it so that you get grenade energy back when breaking Stasis crystals to make it even better if you wanted. Not to mention that this was when pre-nerf Stompies were around, so players would often fly around the map and look for people to Shatter Dive. Another thing you could do was equip Mask of Back Risk to further remove more risk after you dive. This was understandably one of the more frustrating areas of PvP. It made a lot of people upset with the game, and a fair amount of people refused to play as long as the meta remained as it was. Bungie did eventually get around to nerfing Shatter Dive, but by the time they did, the damage had already been done. Stasis left a bad taste in the mouth of players, and it'd be a while until that wasn't the case. In present day, after the nerfs, Stasis is typically on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of usage. You might see a Stasis Hunter or so every now and again, but with the other meta builds out there for the Crucible, it's not high on everyone's list. After dealing with Stasis for a few seasons, everyone was ready for the next meta and something else to liven up the game. After Beyond Light came the Witch Queen expansion, which I think just about everyone can agree brought some pretty great additions to the game, those being the Light 3.0 subclass updates. Each of the original Light subclasses received a complete rework to better fit with the current sandbox. This made the game feel fresh and new again. These changes made trying new loadouts fun and interesting like we were discovering them for the first time. Needless to say, everyone was pretty happy with how things turned out. Of course, after all of these changes were complete, we move on to the current expansion that gave us Strand, Lightfall. Now, after all of these updates, all of these additions, changes, and revisions to the other subclasses, it's safe to say that the next move would obviously be to update Stasis. I mean, everything else was touched on, so why leave it out? It's bound for a rework anyway, right? But what we have to understand is that could put Bungie in a really tight spot. We just talked about what gave Stasis its less than reliable image over the years, and the last thing they'd want to do is put players back in the same meta they hated. It could be as simple as that, but at the end of the day, it's hard to tell exactly why Stasis has been neglected the way it was. There is an argument to make that Bungie simply doesn't like Stasis, but it's really doubtful to be something minor like that. It seems counterproductive to create something just to hate it later, while still using the format it introduced for the updated subclasses and Strand. I have heard that they'll be making some adjustments to Stasis soon, but as of right now, it hasn't been announced what those changes will look like. Although it would be cool to see, I doubt it would be a complete rework like the other subclasses received, since Stasis already has 14 fragments and 4 aspects in each class. But there are still plenty of tweaks that would be great to see. One of the biggest problems across the board for anyone running Stasis in PvE is that Stasis Shards, whose entire purpose is to give ability energy, can give so little. Just for reference, with the right aspects you can shatter a stasis crystal, causing stasis shards to drop. You get a small chunk of melee energy for each one you pick up, but unless you can find a way to constantly make shards, these feel underwhelming most of the time. Not to mention, in order to make them you have to equip an aspect specifically designed for just this particular purpose. I personally don't think it should be required to equip an aspect to collect something like this, because at the end of the day, the melees of each class aren't particularly great enough to make builds around. When compared to the other subclasses, there are ways to consistently and efficiently get ability energy back or abuse status effects more often. Take for example the Solar subclass. Each individual class has the ability to proc the Radiant buff along with Cure and or Restoration. Hunters can endlessly trigger their melee, which will give them Radiance, and with the right fragment combination you can trigger Restoration and keep it active as long as you keep getting kills. Warlocks with Sunbracers can continuously get Cure by killing with grenades, and Titans are an unkillable healing machine with their aspects and bonk capabilities. But this is just an example of how every other subclass is or should be. What defines the PvE meta in Destiny 2 is ability spam. When players are able to consistently use or in some cases outright spam their abilities, that build is typically what becomes the meta. You don't have to look very far to know what I'm talking about. After a few seasons of dominance, the Warlock exotic Starfire protocol was nerfed. The damage output and grenade cooldown you could get with this chest piece equipped was insane. Not to mention the Titan chestplate Heart of Inmost Light, which got nerfed shortly afterwards, spread about how universally good it was. Now these are just a couple of examples, but you can see my point. With just about every subclass, there's a build that lets players abuse abilities to some extent. Okay, so we've talked about some of the general issues with Stasis, so let's look at each class individually. We'll start off with Titans. Currently, Stasis Titan is one of, if not the worst subclass in the game right now. Like I've said before, with other subclasses there are redeeming qualities like ability spam or constant use of status effects, but Stasis Titan receives next to none of it. You're given a melee with the farthest lunge and tracking in the game, which on paper sounds pretty great, but the cooldown is long and making Stasis Shards isn't quite as easy for Titans as it is for the other classes. The only noteworthy thing about this subclass is the big buff to damage its super got, but that by itself isn't really enough to pick Stasis over another subclass. I think that in order to start fixing this, they'd need to rework the aspects because, let's be honest, they're not great. You could essentially merge two of these together to make them somewhat decent, but at that point I think it'd be better just to redo them instead. I want to love Stasis Titan, I really do, but as of right now there's no real reason to use it over anything else in PvE or PvP. Moving on to Stasis Hunter. Although it isn't in quite as much dire need as Stasis Titan, I think that at the moment it'd be cool to see an update on its aspects and a buff to energy given when collecting Stasis Shards. The combos are fine in PvE, but they don't really offer a whole lot of versatility. They essentially slow enemies and that's about it. Normally that'd be fine if they did more damage or if they had extended tracking towards enemies when you throw them, but at the end of the day they just mostly feel underwhelming. The whole point of collecting Stasis Shards is for melee energy, but to get back energy that doesn't really feel like it's going to anything terribly useful is less than desirable. I don't think they'll really change a whole lot about this melee if they even decide to, but fingers crossed we'll get an update to what we have now. Stasis does pair pretty well with Frosties, but it doesn't enhance it enough to warrant a comparison to other builds. In my opinion, the most redeeming quality of Stasis Hunter at the moment is shatter skating. Having a top tier movement option is always a plus and is why a majority of people still use it in PvE. Meanwhile in PvP, where collecting Stasis Shards is more uncommon, Stasis Hunter has seen a small resurgence in popularity. It's not as strong as it was in Beyond Light, but it does have some pros. Being able to slow enemies with combos from around corners can sometimes be effective since it only takes one to slow enemies, which in turn takes away their abilities and jump. The super having a relatively faster cooldown is always nice, and the aspect Touch of Winter enhances your grenades. Not the most meta build for Hunters in PvP currently, but it's not a bad pick either. Finally, we have Stasis Warlocks. Just a quick reminder that this is of course my opinion, but of all the Stasis subclasses, this is undoubtedly the best one. Just like the other subclasses, we'll start with PvE and move on to PvP. In the current sandbox of PvE, Stasis Warlock is one of, if not the best subclass for ad control. On the complete opposite spectrum when it comes to viability, Stasis Lock is a really fun and effective way to abuse the freeze effect on hordes of enemies. If you don't know, you can use the aspect Bleak Watcher, which allows you to spawn a stasis turret that slows and freezes enemies. We can combine this with the other aspect Ice Flare Bolts, which spawns frozen seekers that track and freeze other nearby targets after shattering a frozen enemy. Glue it all together with some fragments and the exotic arms Osmiomancy and you have an awesome build on your hands. This setup takes care of literally everything except bosses. You can take this into anything from Vanguard Strikes to Master Raids to Grandmaster Nightfalls. This build deals with just about all types of enemies. This includes everything from mages to champions and is really great for dealing with enemies that are difficult to manage but don't qualify as champions like wyverns or ogres. Even without the Bleak Watcher aspect, you can still get a ton of grenade energy back just by killing frozen enemies with your Cold Snap grenade. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think Stasis Lock needs to be updated. it. Even without the changes needed for the other subclasses, the versatility of Stasis Warlock is pretty limited. Outside of this build, there's not really anything else that makes Stasis Lock stand out. You have a roaming super and a melee that's guaranteed to freeze enemies on impact, but they're not anything to really write home about. Like I said before, it'd be really cool to see there be more versatility other than using grenades. Just saying this as an example, but maybe if Bungie could find a way to help us do more damage to frozen targets with Stasis, just throwing out some ideas for reference. But just like in PvE, Stasis Lock is also pretty good in Crucible. It's not the most broken or insane build in the world, but it's not bad either. The only trade-off is that if you're running Stasis, you have to understand that your super has a relatively high cooldown timer, so just be prepared. Cold Snap grenades are always a great choice to run, and you can use Osmiomancy here so you can have 2 charges. Cold Snap grenades are always a great choice to run, and you can use Osmiomancy here so you can have 2 charges. Again, not insanely good, but you could definitely run worse builds than this for sure. Out of all 3 classes, there are clearly some that are better than others, but at the end of the day, it's high time Stasis received a serious update. We've seen every other older subclass receive a rework, and it's only fair that we see it soon. I completely understand not wanting to let Stasis be what it was in the Crucible, but I'm still hyped to see what they do because it can really make using it feel fresh and new again. I hope that when touching on it, they keep these things in mind, but find ways to give us reasons to use Stasis again. Since freezing enemies consistently isn't something every class can do, it'd be great to see this and other things get resolved so we can enjoy using it more. But that's about all I have to say. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, guys.